Welcome to lecture number 10, Decolonizing Research. You may ask why research need to be decolonized. Well, if research methodologies need to be decolonized, and indeed they need, it is simply because academic research, and particularly social research, had and still has a constructive role in processes of colonization and in the fact that the impacts of colonization are still relevant on indigenous populations. The relation between colonialism and social research is as old as colonialism itself. And one famous example is Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in late 18th century. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, he didn't bring with him only military forces and administration, but in fact, an army of social researchers came with him to study those people that were about to be conquered and colonized. And the question we need to ask is how these researchers conceive these colonized people and how the system of knowledge that the French brought with them studied the colonized people. How were the colonized people represented for European consumption? The French scientists that came with Napoleon to Egypt, they began creating knowledge about the Egyptians and other Eastern cultures. But this knowledge was created for the eyes and the consumption of Western audiences in Europe. What these scientists created was a sort of modern imagery of what they call the Orient. So this process whereby a colonizer or an occupier come to another place and they conquer that place and they began creating knowledge about those occupied cultures. This process became a sort of model of scientific appropriation of one culture by another, because we need to keep in mind that in these relations of power there is a stronger force, the colonizer force. These relations of knowledge between colonizers and colonized people set in motion a sort of cultural relationships between Europe and Western cultures and the rest that still dominate our cultural and political perspectives. So again, in colonial processes where indigenous peoples were colonized, their societies and their cultures began to be studied by those who colonized them, but with very different systems of knowledge to those of the indigenous peoples that were colonized. And this is why, from an indigenous perspective, the history of social research is always tied with the history of their own colonization. This is true in Australia and elsewhere where similar processes of colonization took place. In one of his books, late Australian historian Patrick Wolfe wrote, whether by accident or design, whether by measuring, quantifying, pathologizing, expunging, or essentializing a comprehensive range of authorities, anthropologists in particular, but also historians, biologists, archaeologists, psychologists, criminologists, have produced an incessant flow of knowledge about Aborigines that has become available for selective appropriation to warrant, to rationalize, and to authenticate official definitions, policies, and programs for dealing with the Aboriginal problem. End of quote. So what Wolf is saying here is that these processes whereby research was tied to colonization were not only about producing a very particular form of knowledge about the indigenous populations that were colonized, but these forms of knowledge were related to and were used by the very political forces that conquer and administer the indigenous colonized populations. It is because of these relations that we insist that those forms of knowledge that we have need to be decolonized. In other words, there is a history of complicity of academic discourse and the production of knowledge with colonialism that not only need to be surfaced and discussed, but need also to be deconstructed so as to bring academic discourse into a realm that is free of those colonial ties and influences. White academic discourse about indigenous people developed very much as all other political forces in colonized land as an invasive practices. And all these social theories about indigenous people were in fact serving political ends and the development of colonial settlement. More specifically, these discourses were used, and they are still used in fact, to justify both white supremacy and assimilation policies. What happens when one culture studies another culture from the former system of knowledge and values is that in fact the second culture, in this case the colonized culture, is misrepresented and their ways of life distorted only to conform with the views of those non-indigenous researchers that are studying them. All these distortions and misrepresentations were used by governments to dominate the indigenous population, to justify their domination. Since the very first stages of colonization in Australia, Aboriginal people were treated as object of research. And up until quite recently, Aboriginal people were described in scientific discussions as an inferior race. And this relates as well, for instance, to the fact that by early 20th century, psychologists evaluated the intelligence of Aboriginal people with European tests. So when they didn't perform well, they just confirmed these social scientists that Aboriginal people were less intelligent than whites. From another perspective, the bones of Aboriginal people were kept in museums, both in Australia and around the world, as specimens. And only in the past 20 years, museums began to repatriate Aboriginal remains. Knowledge in settled colonial societies such as Australia is colonized not only because of the way indigenous people are represented as inferior, but also because researchers of European descent have been exploiting Aboriginal knowledge for their own careers to advance in university. Knowledge that has been given to white researchers has not been a knowledge as pertaining, belonging to indigenous communities, and in many cases, the way the publications about indigenous knowledge has been done has put at risk the safety of the custodians in indigenous communities. So you can understand from these examples why many Aboriginal people are not supportive of research to be done in their own communities by white researchers. Let's look into the works of two early Australian anthropologists in a bit more of a detail. These two people here, Francis James Gillen and Walter Balding Spencer, were two anthropologists that worked together in a couple of books about Aboriginal people. They use evolutionist theory to portray Aboriginal people as extremely inferior to the white man, and their interpretations were used to legitimize oppression. The ethnographies, and more generally the studies of these two social scientists, were tasked to demonstrate that Aboriginal people represented an extreme form of primitivism. They claimed that Aboriginal people lacked all traits of a civilized society, and in this way they erased indigenous people's humanity. The point is, again, that this was not just mere academic knowledge produced by distant social scientists, but first of all, these narratives had a great influence on the settler communities back then in Australia. And as we will see, these people were involved in the politics of settler colonialism. In what ways anthropological studies assisted settler colonial expansion? Well, these anthropological studies help forming the idea that settlement is inevitable as an act of civilization. This is because if Aboriginal people are not civilized people, so first of all, they should be civilized by assimilation, and second of all, the lands that they are occupying should be empty in order to make progress effective on these lands by the settled colonial society. So you can see that there was a sort of correlation of knowledge and politics between these social studies and the political aspiration and the territorial aspirations of the settler colony in Australia. Spencer was also part of the Australian government. He was an advisor on matters of assimilation policy. And in 1911, he was even appointed Chief Protector of Aborigines. This is a quote from his writings. No half-caste children should be allowed to remain in any native camp, but they should all be withdrawn and placed on stations. So far as is practicable, this plan is now being adopted. In some cases, when the child is very young, it must, of necessity, be accompanied by its mother, but in other cases, even though it may seem cruel to separate the mother and child, it is better to do so when the mother is living, as is usually the case, in a native camp. Now, we need to remember that assimilationist policies began in early 20th century, but they continue until late 1960s, and in many senses they are still relevant nowadays in the very expectation of white Australians for Aboriginal people to get over it, as they say, and adapt to white Western ways of life and forms of thinking. As Professor Martin Nakata from UNSW states, this early knowledge production was all about us, and yet had nothing to do with us either. It was quite external to our society and concerns. The conclusion that we adopt here, following this discussion, is that in the social sciences, research methodologies and existing knowledge need to be decolonized, need to be freed for those structures that formed these forms of knowledge and methodologies in a way that they were implicated in systems of colonization. Our next step, then, is to understand better what it means to decolonize knowledge and research methodologies. Professor Linda Tuhiwai Smith from the University of Waikato is one of the most famous researchers, indigenous researchers, working on the issue of knowledge and methodologies decolonization. Her main point is, as we have been explaining so far, that in the Western world, and particularly in settled colonial states, the term research is inextricably connected to European colonialism. So, as she states, when mentioned in many indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that indigenous people even write poetry about research. The ways in which scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism remains a powerful remembered history for many of the world's colonized peoples. It is a history that still offends the deepest sense of our humanity. So, what we have been doing so far, and this particular quote helps us realizing this, sharpening this understanding, is that when we think of colonialism and settled colonialism, we need to factor in this understanding of the link between the production of knowledge and methodologies that Western scientists have been using through colonial periods, and even today with colonialism itself. I let you read by yourselves the following quotation from Professor Smith. So far then the diagnosis. So what it means to decolonize knowledge and research. We understand here decolonization as a long-term process involving the cultural, linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial parameters in all aspects of our life, including the production of knowledge. It includes a series of strategies, among them the self-reflection of non-indigenous researchers regarding the assumptions, the goals, and the methodologies of their research that undoubtedly many times derive from their colonial attitudes. It also involved respecting indigenous research ethics, and I refer you to the lecture where we discuss ethics and also commented about indigenous research ethics. And it also includes claiming research space for indigenous concern, that is, developing research projects that are about indigenous people and for their advantage. Another central aspect of decolonizing research methodologies is that the communities that stand at the center of the research projects take precedent over questions of method and strategy. So, in a similar fashion, like in feminist research, what we pursue with the Decolonizing Research project is the well-being of the community. We do the project for the sake of the community, and this is what takes precedent over any other question related to the research design.
There is a need to decolonize from, say, the processes and the systems that really attacked Indigenous ways of knowing and did their best to not just have a physical genocide of Aboriginal people, but really attempted to kill Aboriginal ways of thinking and Aboriginal ways of doing things, Aboriginal ways of being. So we have to recover from that. But it's not just enough to recover from the sickness that was promoted by that. We have to go beyond so that we can flourish and become healthy and beautiful people again.
So I think we need to understand that research is very much implicated in the colonial project, that it has been part of the marginalisation, the oppression, the dispossession of Indigenous people, and we need to come to terms with that. But at the same time, research is an opportunity for the renewal of relationships. And in the context of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, more recently, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings, there is this opportunity to really engage research as part of the reconciliation process. It really comes down to three core principles. These are that the research be community defined, that the research process itself be collaborative, and that the outcomes of the research be meaningful to the community.
I think if you're viewing research as a way of engaging with community, as a way of promoting change in the community to make our lives beautiful, then we have to include everyone in that. So analogy I often make is that I view myself as a feminist, even though I'm obviously not a woman. Being a feminist doesn't mean that I know the experience of what it means to be a woman, but I can align with the philosophy, align with some of the goals. So I try to use the word indigenous now to describe the philosophy, the beliefs that I'm trying to promote. In recognition that non-Indigenous people often have the same beliefs, often have the same goals.
I love a quotation, actually, I came across a few years ago from an Indigenous geographer, and she indicated that if we assume we're guests, we will be welcome, but if we assume we'll be welcome, we're no longer guests. And it seems to me that captures really the core message, that there is a space for non-Indigenous scholars, but I think it has to be on the terms of the community and Indigenous peoples more broadly.
If we can take a strengths-based approach to the research that we're doing and start to think of our Aboriginality, our indigeneity, our Creeness as a protective factor rather than something that is another risk factor, then it changes the whole focus of how we do research. And I think if we start to engage in community research that looks for community strengths, and how do I engage these community strengths? How do we use these strengths to build even stronger communities? Then it shifts the whole focus away from that, these are the problems with communities, to these are this is our potential. This is how we can do things that are going to make our communities even better. Work with those strengths.
As a geographer who has training in earth sciences, I think what's really worked well for me has been the fact that my interests align with Indigenous communities around a shared interest in the protection of their lands and seas. So my training and my emphasis has not been in studying Indigenous cultures, Indigenous societies, but in working with them to protect traditional lands and their institutions of stewardship and knowledge and tenure and practice.
If we want to promote real change, I think we need to recognize our own subjectivity and work with it. So I always say that if research doesn't change you as a person, then you're not doing it right.